Thank you, Lihi, for this very warm welcome. I'm very excited to be sharing something very personal and dear to me about my grandparents' story. And so I'll begin. So I just want to introduce you to a younger version of my grandparents, Simon on the right, Simon Cohn, or Shimon, as he was called, and my grandmother, Lenka, or Bobby, as she eventually went by when they immigrated to the United States. Um, to me, in this picture, they seem like kind of like any ordinary young couple, just looking happy. Thank you. Genetics, it's a very interesting thing. Um, yeah, so I wanted to give you kind of just an image of, just their faces before I get in. Just they were, any kind of ordinary people, and the unfortunate uh, events that they went through and their families went through, before getting into it. Um, so I would like to introduce you to Shimon. Shimon was born on May 5th, 1925 in Bolesławiec, Poland. Um, I had to do some research because there's a couple
Hello
of
po.
hmm? there are a couple of these towns by the the name Bolesławiec, but this one it's between Wrocław
Sige
and
po.
Lodz. It was very at the time it was on the German-Polish border around that time. And he was the youngest of five brothers and a sister, Meir,
Mm.
Hirsch, Rosa, Yannick, Yidil, and Mendel. He spoke fluent Polish, Yiddish, and German, and he went to public school and Cheder for Jewish school. And Cheder is essentially like a Jewish after school program. Yeah, but he much more enjoyed time playing soccer than learning in the in the Jewish school. He his family was I would say a bit like a lower income bracket. When he was 2 years old in 1927, his father, Abraham, was murdered by someone in the town with anti-Semitic intent. And it was the first night of Hanukkah. And well, kind of like I mentioned, it's the first night of Hanukkah. I don't know why it happens, but it's something that will come back into this story later. But Simon, he was just like some young pisher in Poland, a Jew in Poland, and pretty content, had friends. One story that he told me when I spoke to him was just like, what was it like growing up in Poland? And it was like, yeah, it was fine. And, very small town, like I think 500 families total, mixed of, non-Jewish and Jewish. And that one time he had caught a bird and he brought it in to the cheder, to the Jewish learning school, and released it, and he got in trouble. But I want to share, where he's from and, things about him from where he was. I tried to go there, um, to this town, but I unfortunately did not end up in the right town. As I mentioned, there are a couple different towns with this name, Bolesławiec. He was a king of Poland, and I guess he just, they named a couple of different cities after him. Um, I don't have so much information on my grandfather. I mean, I do have a good amount of information from my own kind of personal investigation and research. But it was very difficult for him to speak about his experiences, and I'll get into that. But these are some pictures that I had found over the years at my grandparents' or at my house or in our family business. So this was the house that they supposedly grew up in. It was actually an apartment building, and they were all on the first floor. So my grandfather was raised by his mother. Her name was Esther, and her maiden name was Fuchs. Um, and she essentially raised six, no, seven kids on her own. This man here, his name is Yannick. This is one of my grandfather's brothers. Um, we'll also talk about him a little bit later. But I found it very interesting because I didn't know so much, as I mentioned, about my grandfather's family. And I came upon a lot of resources online or through people in our community said, oh, yeah, did you know your grandfather or his brothers, they were involved in, the Zionist youth movement in their town? I go, no, I didn't. I didn't. So this is a picture of one of the Zionist youth movements in their town along the Prosna River. And I believe that the person, let me see.
21.
Yes, 21. So he should be right here, if I'm not mistaken, this man, if you can see me point. He had one sister, Rosa. My aunt was named after her, Rosemary. But this is a picture from the school, I guess that they went to. She was much younger, but she was actually older than him. But this is the only photo that we have. So this is her in this school picture, and up here is a more blurry image of her. She was older, and by the time that the war had started, she had already been married and moved to a separate town outside of Bolesławiec in a town called Wilun. And these two men, I unfortunately was unable to document, who is who, but these are two of my grandfather's brothers that had survived. I forgot to mention that Yannick had survived as well, the Holocaust in the concentration camps. But in this photo, I have two more of his brothers, Shaya Hirsch and Mendel. Um, so these are, faces of my grandfather's family. Okay. Um, I'm going to, before getting into everything, I wanted to talk about similarly about my grandmother. So her name was Lenka Polak. Polak was her maiden name. She was born in July 12th, 1921 in Bonyahad, Hungary. So if you can see on this map, here's Budapest, and down here, this little dot, this is where Bonyahad is. And it was a decent sized town. About a third of the population was Jewish, a third were Schwaben, which are those of German descent, and also Hungarians. She was the youngest of three sisters, Theodora, Margarita, Sabina, and her brother Moore. They also went by nicknames. So Theodora's name was Dobie, Margarita was Mindy, and Sabina was Shandy. Um, so they're both from, Central Eastern Europe, but had very different backgrounds. So my grandmother in their house, they spoke Hungarian. Out with the neighbors, she spoke German. And she also learned a little Hebrew, but she didn't grow up speaking Yiddish in the house. In Hungary, I guess they were more integrated into society. And she grew up in an Orthodox house that was very well to do. Her father, my great yeah my great grandfather, his name was Yula. I'll show him a picture of him later. He was a businessman. He was primarily doing import and export of produce from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, and then later manufacturing preserved goods and jams. And I remember my grandmother always telling me about quince jam and how delicious it was. And they had a lot of good things in their house. Also in their town, so they grew up Orthodox. There was also a Neolog synagogue, which in community, which is the reform movement in Hungary. Uh, their house was very modern for the time and had electricity. And I remember she always told me that there were two support beams in the ceiling where they hung gymnastic rings and they would do different kinds of gymnastics. And it was just a very fun place, she said, and always people coming in and out. So these are some pictures of my grandmother, Lenka or Bobby. And for being, she said that she grew up very Orthodox. It's interesting to me because I'm thinking, no longer like longer sleeves and whatnot. But she always said she was a bit of a rebel. Um, this is her somewhere in their town on the farm. She would always talk about how they would, be out in the field and she'd be working with the neighbors who would help in the community. And she said like the best thing ever was getting fresh milk that was warm and being able to drink it before pasteurizing it. This is a cousin of hers. In here we have uh, some people. This is her oldest, no, this is her youngest sister, Shandy. And it looks like they're just having a fun snowball fight. My grandmother here and some of their cousins. This was my grandmother's oldest sister, Theodora or Dobie. And here I have a picture of my grandmother's mother, Regina Pollack. This was her birth mother. But when my grandmother was born, she passed away during childbirth. And then this woman here, she eventually remarried her father. So this is Francisca, and she married Eula here. Um, and essentially, she raised my grandmother and her sisters and brother. And my grandmother didn't know until much later time that uh, her birth mother had passed away and that this was not her biological mother, but she said that she was the most sweetest person ever, and you wouldn't have known. And she was just so kind and warm and treated her very much as her own. And then this man here, this is Mor or Moshe Chaim. This was my grandmother's brother. Um, yeah. I'm just going to stop presenting right now to bring back. So those are some faces to match people that I'm going to mention. I'm going to talk mostly about my grandmother because my grandfather, it was a very extensive time period. He was 14 years old when the Nazis invaded Poland, and because they were very much on the Polish-German border, it was very immediate. I remember hearing that when they invaded, they took everyone out of the town, the Jews, the non-Jews, and brought them over to Germany and essentially had them wait in a field while they were ransacking the town and burning. They burned the synagogue and just facing property. And then finally, after a couple of days, they brought everyone back. And then they started with identification for Jewish residents. Um, he was very young. He was 14. He didn't understand. His older brothers, they were brought into to labor camps. And my grandfather naively was wanting to go with them because he's like, well, it's my first time out of the town and I want to see the world. And at that time it not everything is black and white. It was people were able to communicate and write postal cards to one another and communicate. Um, but he wanted to be with his brothers and he he was told to stay by his mom, so he stayed and he helped out to try to keep the house as much as possible. And with the span of those 6 years until he was eventually liberated on his birthday on May 5th, which was a couple of days ago, which is, I think, a very special way to celebrate your birthday, to having a new lease on life. Um, that he was, going from place to place, from labor camp. Um, he spent some time in a labor camp in Oranienburg. It's outside of Berlin. He eventually was transported to Auschwitz, where he was there in the concentration camp, not Birkenau. And there he saw one of his brothers passing by, and he said that as he was passing by, he threw bread over the fence, and no one saw, and it helped. Every morsel of food or gesture or warm clothing helped. And I don't know, it may seem little or insignificant, but it means a lot, and for the necessity of survival, of taking care of one another. So he didn't talk about his experience. It was something that it was very hard for him, and we tried to ask, and um, but this is the information I have. And then the last bit with him, when he was liberated, there was a death march that was going on, and the Allied armies were approaching. And at this time, they were in Bavaria, just very general. This is where I know they were in Bavaria in southern Germany, and they him and a couple of friends in the camp that they were in at the time. This was outside of Auschwitz. This was already in Germany because the armies were approaching. They were just going from place to place by foot, and someone had the idea out of the three of them that they just split ways because they can see that the Nazis weren't so like motivated because they know that they're going to lose. And he said, let's just run for it. So they ran for it, they were shot after, and then they managed to seek refuge in the woods somewhere. Um, and then by nearby there was I mean, they walked away. They walked quite a while to be able to be away from, being caught. But after walking through the woods, they come to a very small town, and they see, a barn and a farm, and they approach the house and he said, can we have some food and water? And by that time, the war had ended, and the German family that, took them in very briefly was just like astounded and horrified to see what how people went through and like being so thin and filthy. They had lice. They had to be deloused. It's the people were very nice and they fed them food and whatnot, but they just were in shock. They're like they could not believe what people had gone through. Um, so eventually he was liberated in Bavaria. With my grandmother, she was from Hungary. So they were kind of, as she would say, sitting ducks up until 1944. Really, nothing had affected her from what she recalls up until around 1944 when the Nazis invaded. I mean, there was the Arrow-Cross Party, which was the fascist party of Hungary at the time, and also, like most countries, there, was a fascist leader, Nicholas Horthy, and but really her day to day it didn't look different. They weren't put into ghettos for a long period of time. She had her three sisters at this point were already married or out of the house. And it was just her essentially that was in the house. And she was, I want to say 22. She was 22 when the Nazis invaded. She was returning back to her town of Bonyahad from Budapest after spending the Purim holiday in Budapest, which she always told me. Well, I don't know, it seemed like she was exaggerating, but she was always saying that Purim in Hungary was such a festive occasion that it was celebrated by everyone. I was like, I don't know about maybe the non-Jewish citizens, but why not? Um, but it was a very joyous occasion, and always people giving one another the gifts of like hamantaschen and dried fruit and things like that, the mishloach manot or the mishloach manas, as she would say. And as she was coming back from the train, by the time that she got back to Bonyahad, and this was in March 1944, the Nazis were there, and they were defacing property. They had removed my my great grandfather and great grandmother from their house. They had a priest come in to purify with the incense and remove the mezuzah. And I remember her telling me that that was the first time that she saw her father cry. He was a very proud man, and a very smart man and logical, but it, she understood that, something is not right. And I would ask her, go, how could you not know what was going on? And they received newspapers and they had a radio. They would listen to the BBC news program. And she said, you can't imagine someone doing something like what the Nazis did to people. You could not imagine the horrible atrocities that one person can do to another. And it's not that they didn't try to find a way out. My great grandfather Yula, he understood, there's like it's going to be a matter of time when they invade, and it's our turn. And they had a cousin that said, I can get you out. Um, I can get you out to safety, out of Hungary, and maybe to more Southern Europe. Um, but he he was a, a man who didn't see that he could compromise on just allowing his own immediate family. He's like, no, I can't unless my other cousins are able to also be saved. So by the time that the Nazis invaded, and my grandmother got back to her town of Bonyahad in March 1944, it was a very quick process from when they were put into a very temporary ghetto, which lasted less than 2 months, to being deported to Auschwitz, uh, Birkenau, the main extermination camp there. Because at this point it was just a matter of getting rid of Jews as quick as possible. Um, it was a very, from what she told me, it was a very long journey, um, and the conditions were insufferable. Um, Sanitary on the cattle wagon, um, it was not hygienic. If you had to go to the bathroom, you had to find a corner. Um, there wasn't any water. Maybe there was like an icicle that was hanging out from outside the cattle car, and you would break it off. Um, and she was with her mother that raised her, and her father, and her grandmother, and her of the mother that raised her, Francisca's mother. So that when they arrived at Auschwitz, they it was immediate selection, who's going to live and who will not. And one of my grandmother's cousins had a baby with her. And I mean, they didn't know where they were going. They, they didn't know what was happening. Maybe they heard of these places. But my grandmother's cousin said to my great grandmother, Francisca, can you please hold the baby? I'm going to be back in a minute. I left my diapers and other things on the train. And so it was very quick that the cousin, she went back to the cattle car, and then the Nazis come, start to, you know, sort, which side you're going on. And this was the moment that my grandmother was separated from her mother and never saw her again. Sorry. Um, she wasn't at Auschwitz for very long. It was maybe just a matter of 2 months in Birkenau. She also had another cousin that was in her lager, in her cabin, and she said that she tried to help her when she could, um, but it was really just a matter of waiting that time. Um, Around like the 2 month period they were there, someone had recognized my grandmother from her hometown. It was a neighbor boy that was a was a Nazi, and she knew that okay, he was in the German army, something, but she couldn't imagine that he was, in this place, a place that she said that when they arrived, everyone, heads were shaved. She's like there's a lot of crazy people here that they thought when they arrived to Auschwitz that there's like a lot of mentally unwell people, because that's what she associated, or was associated at the time, um, with shaven head and kind of like a sanatorium. Um, but again, it's not really, you can't imagine that these things could happen or would happen or happen to someone you know. Um, so this neighbor soldier that was in the camp. He recognized my grandmother with no hair, and very different looking. Uh, that he came up to her and he said, "Listen, there's going to be a selection tomorrow during this time, and you and anyone you know from the town just stay inside and hide, and I will signal you to come out um, when I do." And this, I don't know who he is, but I mean, this is one instance of she was saved. Because if she had stepped outside, she probably wouldn't have been here. I wouldn't have been here. Um, like I understand that not everything is black and white, and how interesting, and how s- even in these circumstances that someone from her town recognized her and wanted to save her. It's to me, it's remarkable. From then, they were moved to another camp in Auschwitz. It was like a giant facility, and this was weapons manufacturing. And then she said that the conditions were better and they were fed better. Um, and then after a couple more months, the Russian army was approaching, and by this time they were, transporting those that didn't go to death marches to other camps. She was sent to another labor camp where she was put to manufacture um, other bombs and weapons. And I mean, she had to do what she had to do, and it was very dangerous um, work environment in terms of working with explosives. But she's like, my God, these are these are the weapons that are killing us. Um, there was an incident in this camp that there was a very nasty uh, SS officer woman that was just out for blood one day, and she some for some reason pointed out my grandmother, and she had a whip on her, and she whipped her back. And my grandmother, she had on her back from her upper neck, and then she said it went down to her mid back was the lesion from the whip. And that even just thinking about that memory, it stings. And I don't know how to explain, but when I was very close with my grandmother, and I was very fortunate that she was with me until my early 20s. But just looking into her eyes and feeling this pain, like I could feel it for her. So eventually the war is ending by the time she's in Germany. In these labor camps, at this point, it's just going from one place to the next on cattle car until one day in early May, the car just stops, and then there's an explosion that the Russian army had advanced, and the Nazis just tried it at their last attempt to kill as many people as possible by blowing up one of the cattle car. Um, and she was liberated in the harbor town of Neustadt in Holstein. So I'm going to go back real quickly to the presentation. Uh, so this is where she was liberated around. And shortly after, she fell ill from typhoid fever, when it was hospitalized in, she said it was a Swedish hospital. Um, there's a little bit of a joke that we had in our family, because up until a couple of years ago, we thought her birthday was in 1923, until she approached my father and my aunts, and she huddled them in one Shabbat. And she goes, I'm actually a couple years older, and they're like, oh my God, I think she's a little senile. But no, this is true because when she was hospitalized and she had very high fever and was delusional, they asked her, what's your birth year? But, maybe she misheard them and she said 23 because she was born in 1921, but she said that 23 was when she was born, but she was 23 years old when she was hospitalized with typhoid. And there in the hospital, she met a young man named Yannick, and the same Yannick from earlier. So here's a picture of Yannick and my grandmother and my grandfather. The story's a little bit different right now, eventually, than how it ends up. But Yannick had met my grandmother in the hospital, and he took care of her and helped her and nursed her back to health, and he really fancied her, and she fancied him. It was mutual. She would joke around and say, he was like twice the size of me. I could, like wrap myself around his waist. Like that's how much taller he was than her. Um, but so Yannick, he had survived the camps as well. I don't have them. I wish I knew more, but I don't know what his experience was or where he was or his my grandfather's other brothers. But um, their plan was that they were going to immigrate to the British Mandate of Palestine to Eretz Israel after the war. That was the plan, that they were to marry there and start their lives. My grandmother, she knew that her three sisters had survived. They had false papers in Budapest, and that's where they were living throughout their time. And unfortunately, her brother Moore, he perished at Mauthausen concentration camp. So these two, um, the plan was to immigrate, and Yannick had heard that his brother Simon was alive, and then a couple more other brothers were alive. So they were waiting in the town they were from in Bolesławiec, and he said, I'm gonna go there, I'm gonna go see what's going on and see if there's anything left, any monetary things we can take with me or any information. So at this time, my grandmother, Bobby, she had already healed, and it was taking a while for Yannick to return from the town they're from in Poland. And so Simon said to Bobby, okay, because Yannick said that Simon needs to stay with Bobby, that she shouldn't stay alone, and just watch after her as she was still healing. So they ended up going to Bavaria, to around the town that he was liberated in. They didn't spend any time in a displaced persons camp. They went to a town called Laufen in southern Germany. It's right across the border from Salzburg. And there they were just waiting to hear if there's any more information about Yannick and his brothers. My grandfather, he went to Frankfurt to see if there's any other information they could get, maybe from one of the Jewish organizations for displaced people or from the Red Cross. And that's when he heard that his three brothers, there was an altercation in their town on the first night of Hanukkah in 1945, and at the end of November, that a group of extreme nationalists in Poland had come into the town. I'm not understand. I don't know what the circumstances were behind it, but they came in. They heard that Jews had returned to the town, and my grandfather's brothers that survived, three of them, and other people from their town that were there by chance were murdered in a pogrom. And my grandfather went back to the town of Laufen, where my grandmother was waiting to hear back from Simon about Yannick, because at the time these two were engaged. And my grandfather comes back, and she had a feeling. She's like, when did it happen? And he was completely broke, and he didn't have a will to live. He's like, I should have gone with my brothers. I should have been with them. But my grandmother, she couldn't allow this guilt to weigh on my grandfather. And she she took it upon herself to say, listen, you can come with me. I want to go to Hungary. I want to go to my town and see, if my sisters are at home, if there's anything that I can take with me before we, come back to Germany, where they resided for about 4 years after the war. So there's a tradition in Judaism that I wasn't aware of, but um, when someone passes away and they're engaged, the next person that the woman marries is the brother. So um, my grandmother and grandfather, that's how they got married, and um, after many years, there was very much it was the right thing, and there was a lot of love and a lot of good times despite the pain and hardship. So this is where the town of Laufen is in southern Bavaria. You can see here there's Salzburg. This is a postcard of the town. This is my grandfather Simon and my grandmother Bobby on their wedding day. And just some pictures of them, their new life. My grandfather, he at the time was selling cigarettes on the black market, going from Austria to Germany. I don't know where he was selling and where he was buying, but that's what he was doing. And he had a motorbike. And I mean, this is the only picture that I have of the motorbike, but I remember my grandmother saying, like, I'll never get on that thing. Um, but this is a picture of them with on their motorbike and another person. I'm not sure who that is. Um, they had a German Shepherd, or kind of mixed, when they were living in Germany. His name was Ralph. So this is my grandfather with Ralph as a puppy, and my grandmother with Ralph as a little bit bigger. Okay. So they decided they were not going to immigrate to Israel, and they were just, they were taking their time. Life was fine for them in Germany. People were kind to them. They're just trying to save as much as they could. My eldest aunt, Edie, she was born in Laufen, Germany in 1947. Um, and they eventually immigrated to the US after being sponsored through an organization called Jewish Children and Family Services, and also organized through the highest organization for displaced Jews from after World War II. So they heard that it wasn't a decision of where they were going. They were sponsored by this organization in St. Louis. And when they were told where St. Louis is, they're like, oh, nice. You can't see here, but it's like, oh, it's on the river. It's on the Mississippi. They looked on the map, and my grandmother immediately thought about her days when she used to go to apparently swim on the Danube. She goes, oh, Simon, that's great. We can go swimming in the summers on the beaches. And it's funny to me because the Mississippi is not such a swimmable river, and it's really dirty. But it's very cute and how excited and they were looking forward to their new life. So they took a ship from Bremerhaven port, and they arrived in St. Louis on the first on Simchas Torah in 1949, and that's where they made a life for themselves and a family. I remember my grandmother saying that every ounce of assistance helped them greatly when they moved to St. Louis, and they owe everything to the community that helped them. Um, so they moved to the United States. They're officially Americanas, and they need to find a living, to work. So my grandfather, he was a delivery driver for a butcher in St. Louis, and he was very strategic. He would observe how the butcher would work, and he's like, I can do that. I just need to keep my eye out on how he's doing things. But this is a picture of when he was a delivery driver, his first job in St. Louis. They were taking English classes in the evening. He was working um, during the day. Um, yeah, just trying to provide for their family. There's some pictures. It's my grandfather and my dad is a child, infant, and my grandmother, my grandfather, and my eldest aunt Edie, and my aunt Rose, and my dad, Lenny. This is my grandmother and my dad lighting Hanukkah candles. Hanukkah was always a bit of a mixed holiday because of the things that personally happened to my grandfather. Um, but it was always a joyous occasion too in our house because it was an opportunity for us to come together and light the candles and to eat delicious food. So not even despite the pain, there's a lot of joy and love. So this is my grandmother and my grandfather as they're a little bit older. They've really come into their business. They started their business in 1962. Um, and it started off as like a little grocery, and my grandmother got the idea of expanding their menu to be more of a deli after going to World's Fair in New York in the 60s. And she saw these vendors selling knishes and other kind of Jewish staple foods. And she goes, we can do that. So that's really when their business shifted to offering deli foods, sliced meats, dishes. Um, yeah. Um, One thing that I really enjoyed that she used to make was strudel, and she would lay it down on a very long table, and it would be very thin dough, and just seeing her roll it up, it was quite a process. This is my dad and my grandfather, Simon, outside of the old location of their store, which they moved to across the street to a much more bigger venue. And this is a dairy restaurant that my father had opened up called Noble Cafe. But this is the adorning of the mezuzah on the door for the opening of the restaurant. My grandmother and my father in the kitchen. My grandfather, some friends. They had a lot of friends. They had a lot of other Holocaust survivor friends in town. They used to play cards together or schmooze. They often referred to themselves as greenies, I guess because they were newcomers, like I guess from the reference of a green card. And kind of like a little lineage of my grandfather and my dad and me, all at various points working at our deli. And it's a landmark and really just an astonishing story of how coming from what they went through in growing their own personal business to how it was. These are some pictures of my grandmother when they went back to Hungary in the 80s with my aunts and my mom. And she very much was happy to be back here. They're on a river cruise on the Danube. And she very much loved to sing. Um, so I think this is just her singing at some restaurant. I had the opportunity to go to where my grandmother's from, because I was always very interested. It's like I need to see, where I'm from to understand, who I am. So this is outside of the Neolog synagogue that the community there, the Hungarian community, put together to honor the people of their town. So outside, this is the same banner on the inside of the bima, the center stage of the synagogue. This is the Reform synagogue. This is my grandmother as a little child and her brother Moore. This is the cemetery of the Jewish cemetery in their town. And this was my great grandmother, Regina Pollock, the one that passed away during childbirth. This was the exterior of the house that I heard so much about growing up, of my grandmother's house in Hungary. I even met the people that live there now, and they're very sweet. They were the descendants of the maid, the family. They're very nice, and they're like it's so nice to meet, the grandson of Lenka. Um, I remember her telling me like this is where the trains deported eventually um, to the fate of the community. And just me with several pictures of um, my grandmother and her brother, and this memorial outside of the Reform synagogue in in their town, and also with my grandmother's other family. And this is what the outside of the Orthodox synagogue looked like in the 80s. It was really not well maintained. And on the inside, you can see there's even a Jewish star remnant. And this is what it looks like now on the outside. But overall, despite everything, they had a very nice life, and they had a lot of love and very much a lust for life. They loved each other very much and were inseparable to the very end. This is a picture of my grandmother and Dr. Ruth Westheimer, if anyone knows who that is. They loved to come to Israel to visit. They visited my aunt when she was living on Kfar Blum. And this is them somewhere in Israel. Just various miscellaneous pictures. This is her and her oldest sister, Dobi, that visited a couple of times. And just other friends and joyous memories that we had. And that's the story of my grandparents.
Thank you, Jake. It was like amazing.
I really didn't expect to talk for an hour. I was like maybe half an hour. I want to leave you with one thing that my grandmother would say. She had a lot of great sayings, um, but one of them was um, when when one thing goes out the back door, it comes in through the window, which, if I remember correctly, is, there will always be something coming back to you, even if it leaves. And I think I'm grateful and yeah, grateful to be here and to share their story. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jake.
Thank you.
Beautiful story.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
sharing.
you.
Thank
Thank you, man.
Thank you very much.